Have you ever really stopped to think about how important those first few years of a child's life actually are? We tend to focus a lot on, high school, college, but the real foundation for learning, for well-being, for their whole future, it's often set way before they even see a formal classroom. So what do you think really goes into building a solid early education system, especially somewhere like India, so vast, so diverse? Today we're doing a deep dive into some, well, pretty profound changes happening in India's early childhood care and education, ECCE, as it's known. And this isn't just fiddling around the edges. It feels like a fundamental structural shift, and it's largely driven by the National Education Policy 2020, the NEP. Historically, private schools in India, they've had nursery classes for ages, right? Giving lots of kids a head start. But for most kids, government schools usually only took them from class one. And you can see right there, that immediately creates a kind of disadvantage, doesn't it, from day one?
Exactly. And what's really interesting, I think, is how the NEP 2020 goes straight at that historical imbalance. It's effectively opening the door for dedicated preschool classes. They're specifically called Balvatika 1, Balvatika 2, and Balvatika 3. And these are for 3 to 6-year-olds right inside government schools. This isn't just some small policy adjustment. It's about trying to level the playing field from age 3, really, offering kids from all backgrounds those foundational learning experiences that, well, until now were often a privilege. Just imagine a child who maybe wouldn't have had access before, now walking into a government preschool, getting ready for class one instead of starting, years behind.
Okay, right. Let's try and unpack this a bit then. So, our mission for this deep dive, let's explore three key structural shifts happening in ECC, all coming out of the NEP. We look at how each one is actually playing out on the ground and crucially what it means for ensuring quality early childhood care and education for all of India's children. And yeah, this deep dive is based on insights from a really interesting article called Electorale Theoristic God de Ankan Insikia Jolintia Estrakia Thamalekala. So, this first big shift, it seems to be just the sheer scale of expansion in the ECCE sector itself. It's a huge, maybe even a bit under the radar move towards universalization by 2030. I mean, for decades, the public ECC setup was kind of stuck around those 1.4 million Anganwadi centers. But that's all changing now, isn't it? What does that kind of growth actually look like in practice?
It's definitely more than just numbers, it's strategic. If you think about it, with the NEP allowing these 3 Belvatica classes in government schools, the total number of public ECCE classes is set to, well, skyrocket. And that has massive implications right across the board: how you manage staff, funding, how you recruit, train, and deploy enough skilled ECCE teachers. The Ministry of Education has already started putting money aside under the Samagra Shiksha scheme. That's the big umbrella program for universalizing school education specifically for ECCE. And many states and union territories have started using this to set up these preschool classes, which is, a good sign. But we're also seeing some places haven't really started using it yet, or maybe they've underused it, perhaps just adding a bit of training or materials without actually creating the extra classes. So, yeah, the extent to which this is actually happening definitely needs close monitoring.
And okay, as these new preschools open up in schools, it naturally changes things for the existing centers, right? Which I guess leads us straight into the second shift you mentioned, this growing emphasis on the education part compared to other ECCE services like health and nutrition. It seems like there's a clear trend where parents, if they have the choice, are really preferring the preschool classes in schools over the Anganwadis.
That's exactly the dynamic we're seeing play out. The Union Territory of Dadra and Nagar Haveli and Daman and Diu is a really good case study here. They've put a preschool class in all their primary schools, and they're prioritizing kids aged 4 to 6 for admission. And what's happened? A really significant number of kids in that age group have moved from the Anganwadis over to the schools. It's largely, it seems, driven by this perception that schools just offer better educational opportunities, and parents understandably want that. The challenge then becomes the traditional picture of Anganwadis, these community childcare centers as these vibrant places full of toddlers. That's now kind of at risk. As more government schools open preschool classes, those 3 to 6-year-olds will naturally shift out. So the big question is, how do Anganwadis adapt? They absolutely have to step up the education side of what they offer. The Ministry of Women and Child Development has this Poshan Bhi Padhai Bhi initiative, which literally means nutrition and education too. That's a timely step, definitely. But its success really depends on what happens on the ground. Like, are Anganwadi workers actually spending more time on educational activities? And on the other side of the coin, schools need to be careful too. They need to avoid excessive schoolification of preschool. You know, at this age, learning isn't just about the ABCs, it's got to be about building blocks, singing songs, exploring through play. They really need to keep play central to focus on that broader range of skills, not just narrow it down to reading and writing too early.
That's such a critical point, isn't it? Balancing that formal learning with play. And this brings us to what the source suggests might be the most profound shift of all, potentially, which is this possible reorientation of the whole Anganwadi system to really focus on the 0 to 3-year-olds through crucial home visits instead of mainly the 3 to 6-year-olds who come to the center.
Yes, this is where the potential for long-term impact gets really interesting. Research, time and again, shows just how vital home visits are in early childhood programs. You see it in famous studies like the Perry Preschool at 50 in the U.S. They followed people for decades and showed lasting benefits from early interventions that included home visits. And closer to home, there was that Yale University study in Odisha working with Pratham, which also highlighted the power of these targeted early supports at home. In India, you know, policymakers like V.K. Paul and N.C. Saxena have argued for years that the ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Services Framework, should really focus more on that 0 to 3 age group. Why? Because the developmental gains during that specific window are just disproportionately massive. Now, the Prime Minister's overarching scheme for holistic nourishment, the Poshan Abhiyan, it has emphasized the importance of the first 1,000 days. But there are real implementation challenges. Anganwadi workers are often overburdened, right? So they naturally tend to focus on the 3 to 6-year-olds who are right there, physically present in the center, which leaves less time and scope for those really important individualized services for the 0 to 3s through home visits. So if the government schools genuinely take on the main responsibility for the 3 to 6-year-olds, well, that creates this unique opportunity. The Anganwadi system could potentially redirect its entire focus onto the 0 to 3s, alongside caring for pregnant and lactating mothers through much more intensive home visiting. That shift, if it actually happens successfully, could be a real game changer for India's whole ECCE framework. And the seeds for this transition, they were definitely sown in the NEP 2020.
Okay, so just to quickly recap these, well, pretty huge shifts we've talked about.
Yeah.
First, this massive expansion of the whole ECCE sector aiming for universal access by 2030. That's enormous. Second, this fundamental movement of the 3 to 6-year-olds out of Anganwadis and into government schools and what that means for how Anganwadis need to adapt. And third, this potentially transformative pivot of the Anganwadi system to really zero in on the 0 to 3 age group through those critical home visits.
Absolutely. And if you connect this all to the bigger picture, the potential impact on India's children is just profound. Early childhood development, we know, is absolutely critical. It really does lay the groundwork for a child's entire life journey. So these changes, if they're implemented successfully on the ground, could really mark a paradigm shift, a truly transformative moment for India's ECCE framework. As we said, the blueprint, the foundation for this, it was clearly laid out in the NEP 2020. Now it's all about making it a reality.
So it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What does all this mean for the future of education and child development? Not just in India, maybe there are lessons here for globally too. What's the right balance between formal education starting earlier and the fundamental importance of play-based learning and that critical support that happens at home? It really raises a key question. How can we best support these absolutely foundational years for every single child, everywhere? We definitely encourage you, if you're interested, to maybe explore some of those early childhood development studies further. Perhaps look into the long-term results from the Perry Preschool at 50 study or the findings from that Yale study in Odisha with Pratham. And also maybe think about the sheer complexity of implementing policies like this in huge, large-scale social programs. It's never simple, is it?